Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is session 7. And without further ado, we'll get straight into it because there's a lot to unpack. So if we can share the screen, let's see, do this and then go to here and share. And I just want to make sure I can see the chat off to the side. That's good. And we're ready to go. So this one is Loving Your Landscape, and it's touching on work that we've done previously to this about using the landscape for inspiration. But this one is, I'm going to try and get it to be more of a local vibe. And so that if it's local, it's easier to develop that deep connection to place. So there we go. So our learning objectives today are to research climate change impacts within the local community. And I actually got this idea from going to a climate crack conference in September in Belfast, and it was really, really good, really, really well set up. And I was sitting listening to some of these organizations talking about what they're doing at the minute. And I thought, you could get so much written work out of any of that because of the conflicts involved with a lot of this stuff. So it was hugely inspiring to how the people were putting so much effort into highlighting what needed to be done in the community. So from that, we could develop compelling human interest narratives about those directly affected by local climate issues. So if you're writing blog posts or if you're writing something more creative like a story or a poem or even a play, all of that would definitely be fodder, if you like, for that. So if we look at the 3 pillars of effective climate writing, we've looked at those, the first two in some detail, and we're continuing on with the second one, looking at local impact, looking at relatable scenarios, because of course, if we're living in that location, it is a relatable scenario. And then we're looking at a solution focus, actionable steps, success stories. Unfortunately, one of our stories is not yet a success story, but some of them are, which is really heartening, and tangible outcomes. So look at our local organizations who are actually working for change right now as we speak. So what I want to think you to think about is how can you use your writing as a call to action close to home. Many local environmental groups will have climate action at the heart of their campaign, even if their immediate issue is something different. Because you'll find if you dig deep enough, climate action is the climate change and the issues surrounding climate change, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and other greenhouse gases. It's really at the heart of a lot of the problems that we're seeing environmentally. So habitat loss, for example, is one of those that it's nearly buried deeper down, and you think it's about something else, but you can usually unearth that it is going to be about climate change. You could do seminars about just environmental issues, but we've sort of tried to hone this and keep this one to climate change. So that's why I'm kind of highlighting that. So let's look at Lough Neagh. So again, this is one of those ones where the science is complex, very complex. But I'm going to try and very quickly unravel that in sort of, I don't want to say layman's terms, but in a way that we can understand it a little bit better. And a lot of this comes down to some of the terminology, again, is problematic because it's not, what's causing the problem is a cyanobacteria, which is technically not an algae. It's a bacteria that photosynthesizes. Okay, so it uses the sun's energy to photosynthesize, but it also needs nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, and it gets those nutrients from runoff from agriculture. And where that runoff is coming from is all the rivers and streams that surround Lough Neagh are all running through agricultural land, and that land is having nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers put onto it. It's having, and even when farmers are trying their best to be sort of environmentally friendly, organic, even if they're using manure and agricultural sort of processes like that, their aim is to get nitrogen and phosphorus into the soil. Unfortunately, with our high rainfall, the water gets flushed through the soil and carries with it this nitrogen and phosphorus into the rivers and ultimately into Lough Neagh. And that's where the problem is arising. Now, it's a threefold problem. This is only one element of it, okay? It's more than threefold, actually, but the main three are what I'm going to discuss. So this cyanobacteria grows in the water. And it is that blue-green algae look that we associate with the algal bloom. Now, climate change researchers from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute found that the temperature in Lough Neagh is 1 degree higher than it was in 1995. And that temperature rise is benefiting the cyanobacteria over the competing species. So the cyanobacteria is always in fresh water, but usually there are enough other organisms, microorganisms like algae, other bacterias, just unicellular organisms in general, that the competition keeps the cyanobacteria down. However, because of the slight change in temperature, that is benefiting the cyanobacteria and it is winning in the competition for resources. Things that happen, for example, is that when you raise the temperature of water, you lower the amount of gases that can dissolve in water. And so, for example, oxygen, there's less oxygen in water. So it's subtle little things like that. And then we also have a problem with an invasive species. So the zebra mussel has invaded the loch for almost 2 decades. And what it does is it filters the water. So the water goes through this little organism and it filters out all the little unicellular organisms, one cell big organisms that it likes to eat and what it feeds on. However, it doesn't feed on the cyanobacteria. So again, not only is the cyanobacteria got more beneficial environment to live in, but now the main predator is eating all its buddies or all its competitors, if you like. So now the cyanobacteria has an even bigger edge. Add to the fact that cyanobacteria uses sunlight to photosynthesize and grow. So now we've also got clearer water, so the sunlight is penetrating deeper and it's just compounding the problem. So you can see how these problems are all playing into promoting the cyanobacteria. There are other problems. The dredging of the loch doesn't help either. But really what that's doing is adding an extra stress. If the environment wasn't so stressed from these top three issues, you could maybe get away with that. But it's such a stressed out system that any other thing coming in is just going to make things worse. So the algal bloom in Lough Neagh, and we're calling it algal bloom, but remember it's a cyanobacteria. The algal bloom in Lough Neagh has a number of consequences, including poor water quality. That's for us humans, that is. So the water has become a major health hazard. Disappearing wildlife. I don't know if anybody saw it. I'm not putting the picture up because it is actually very disturbing and very upsetting. But there was an awful photograph that did the rounds during the summer of an otter, dead otter, covered in this blue-green slime. And it's so sad to think that those predators at the top of the food chain are just getting wiped out by this. But yeah, birds and fish are disappearing as well. Otters are a mammal, so that's another example of that. There are bathing bans, not just in the freshwater areas that this is affecting, but this algal bloom is going out through the ban up to the north coast, and the beaches along the north coast are also affected by this. So it has a very far-reaching effect. So this is a photograph of it. It looks absolutely horrible. And this is an article. I've given you the link for that in the chat and at the end of the slides. And there is a lot of stuff online about it. And again, so in here they're talking, it's such a complex thing, but in here they're talking about, you can see here it talks about 80% of the bacterial DNA belong to hazardous microbes, including E. coli and Salmonella, and 11 others that can cause, and they haven't actually mentioned cyanobacteria at all. And it's just because they don't want to maybe confuse, and they also want to say E. coli and Salmonella because they're the ones that sort of Joe Blogs reading the paper or whatever will be like, oh, I've heard of those and they're not good. So that sort of explains some of the reporting on it. Bottom line is it's not good news, and sadly I don't have a happy ending. However, this this is a PDF file that you can download, and it's a report about everything that's happening with Lough Neagh. And I have it in good authority. I've actually checked with somebody who's a scientist who's working on this. Asked him for a reference, and he directed me to the Rivers Trust. And this is the front and back page of it, but basically this is their call to action. And it's, yeah, if it's something you're interested in, these are the bodies that you can sign up to find out more about and get involved. So I'm going to move on because that one's too sad to dwell on. And we're going to look at the Stop Whitehall Oil Terminal. This is a relatively good story in that they successfully halted a multi-million pound expansion of an oil terminal on the shore of Belfast Lough in September 2024. Now, a multi-million pound oil terminal on the shoreline of Belfast Lough would have been an absolute environmental catastrophe for the area. It's unnecessary, especially if we're moving towards a net zero climate target. We don't need to be putting in infrastructure for fossil fuels and fossil fuel distribution. And what would have happened was oil from all over the world would have come in big tankers, and then it would have been dispersed into maybe smaller ships. This is my understanding of it anyway. They put into smaller ships to be sort of dispensed out throughout Europe. There would have been an element of spillage. There would have, but this is after the upset of actually building the oil terminal in this very environmentally sensitive area. So unnecessary, because we shouldn't be trying to rely on fossil fuel anymore. We want to move away from that. The construction itself would increase greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, you can imagine all that concrete and digging and just the vehicles getting to there would have caused. And then they talk about this downstream. So downstream impact is, what is happening later on in terms of the impact. So in this case, you'd be bringing in all this oil, and then there's the fossil fuels dispensed, from the facility being burned, adding to the climate issue. And just even things like vehicles on tiny little roads heading down towards this, this oil terminal, that it wouldn't have, you'd have to build bigger roads to support the infrastructure, and what impact that would have on the local community. So all in all, it was a bad for the environment, bad for the local communities. So I'm going to this is the blog. And what I liked about this was that there's this this idea of, in this first paragraph here, so this is why I've put this up, we as writers can pull people in, and this pulled me in because I love the idea of this person sitting in the coffee shop with the relief of this having been stopped. So there aren't many things that taste better to a public interest litigator than a Café Carberry coffee after a positive outcome at Belfast's High Court. So that was just, and even down here they talk about fueled by caffeine, adrenaline, and gratitude. So there, it's a lovely, relief-filled, joyful post. So that's all good news. Then we have Friends of the Earth and No Gas Caverns campaign. That's another one. So Friends of the Earth supported this campaign, and it successfully won a legal challenge to stop the construction of 7 large gas storage caverns under Larne Lough. The environmental protection for this, the court ruling emphasised the importance of protecting the marine environment, which is home to various protected species, and is a designated special protection area. What's really important in this one, and it's going to hopefully play into any further, this ruling was stopped. This ruling cannot be overturned or appealed or anything. This is my understanding in reading the literature on this. Whereas they're still fighting for the Whitehead oil terminal issue, right? So in this case, the decision sets a precedent for future environmental decision making in Northern Ireland, requiring that climate impact and downstream emissions, and we talked about, remember the downstream emissions, what carbon emissions are going to be happening later in time because of this. So this has to be considered now in planning processes. And that's really good news, because that really supports the idea of a climate impact assessment. So that's really good news. And I took this off their website verbatim because, again, it's a lovely example of climate writing. If you could peek beneath the waves where Larnloch sweeps out to sea from behind Island Magee in Northern Ireland, you'd see wildlife everywhere. Seals, porpoises, and dolphins gliding through the water, with lobsters, crabs, and starfish scuttling among the rocky floor and seaweed fronds. So that's on the Friends of the Earth website. And I just thought, again, there's just this beautiful underwater painting. They have set you into, this nearly Disneyland-like scenario with all these different creatures. And they are talking about the higher level creatures in terms of, what we as people look for. But I mean, there's all the little micro and the smaller, maybe less appealing creatures that are going to benefit, and it keeps the food chain intact and all that. So it's a lovely little piece of writing. So then the other one I wanted to look at was the RSPB for Northern Ireland, and it's a very big organisation, and it's got an excellent example of how nature conservancy permeates many different aspects of nature and prioritises climate action by supporting robust environmental governance and legislation. Nature-friendly farming, and that's something that we here really need to take account of. Peatland restoration, again, something that's very relevant to this part of the world. Renewable energy infrastructure in harmony with nature. So I think what they're talking about here is things like the wind farms and how they, you hear reports about wind farms killing birds and things. So it's trying to design a wind farm that isn't going to have such a big impact on the bird life in the area. Protecting and managing habitat. And this is a lovely, again, good news story, a big hooray. I love that they have this little emoticon in here. But the breeding season results are in from Lower Lough Erne on Trasna Island. Breeding wader numbers have soared from 0 to 19 pairs in just 5 years. Without habitat transformation on the island, we wouldn't have these incredible results. Redshank have an incredible year, with their numbers jumping to 59 pairs on the reserve and an increase of 19 pairs in just 1 year. So it's all good news. And I've taken that from their Facebook page. And again, the links are at the end. But they also have, you see, like if you go down into this sort of part, so when you see posts like this, if you start going into this part of the, you often get really good resources. So if you're writing something and you want to follow through and see what else people are saying about it or what other information, I often go into these links and read around the subject that way. So you have plenty to choose from, just even with that. But there's also Save Our Sperrins, which is an activist group in Antrim, and they are trying to combat extra mining in the area. You've got Eco Justice Ireland, which is a great umbrella organisation, and they will look at lots of different, and they probably link up a lot of these different organisations as well. And if there is an eco justice issue, you can actually contact them. They have lawyers and everything, or solicitors on hand to talk to you, and they're very easy to approach. I've spoken to them myself just in terms of writing to ask for advice, so they're really good. Then of course there's Climate Crack, who if you follow them, they can sometimes have these great pop-up conferences and that with lots of things to look at there. So if you know of any others, please do drop them in the chat. If you've got a local group that you know of that you're working with, or you'd like to work with, or want to know more information about, or anything at all, just drop the names in the chat and let's get sharing. And sharing is caring, they say. So let's get that going, and I'll let you do that in your, as we go on through. And I just wanted to again, it is the library. So if you feel compelled to do a little bit of reading, this is a gorgeous book by Ruby Free on the environment and climate writing and wildlife writing, and just thought I'd put that up there for you. And just I'm catching this in the chat. The RSPB have encouraged corn crakes back to Rathlin. Very tuned in there to my slide, by bringing in nettle roots to provide their preferred habitat. Oh, very good. I have a lot of nettles in my garden, not necessarily on purpose. Although I don't actually. Nettles are a good thing to have on the edges of your property. One, because people aren't going to come through nettles to get into your property, but also they are a great resource for butterflies. Is it mini tortoise shell butterflies? They love those, and so having little islands of nettles around the place is not a bad thing. So that's great. Thank you, Jane. Okay. Oh, this is going to be your writing exercise. So you are writing a blog post or an information flyer about a local campaign that you are passionate about. Write the opening line. You can write the whole thing after this, but for the exercise, write the opening line. Keep it visual, emotive, yet grounded in science. So think of how that underwater scene played out from the Friends of the Earth website. Think also about who is your target audience. Are you trying to get through to people who wouldn't normally think about these things? Are you preaching to the converted? Are you talking to a classroom of kids? Are you talking to your grandchildren? Are you talking to people your own age? Just that's always something to keep in the back of your mind. How do you want them to feel? So think about how you want them to feel when they read the first line. And then we'll share it in the chat. So I'm going to flash up. So while you're doing that, you'll have 5 minutes to do that from now. You can ignore me. I'm going to just finish off the slides, and then we'll stop the video so that we can share. So that's the final slide with the different resources.